answer your Bible questions. So if you have questions, you can email the email behind me, crosswalkradio@gmail.com. There's also a number, 707-872-7677, and you guys can text that or leave a voicemail, and we'll throw it on the show or the next show if you guys send it during the week. Locally, I just have a couple announcements for you. Our new church times for our outdoor amphitheater service on Sunday mornings are 8:30 and 10:30. Do you want to say any reasons of why we're doing that, or you just want me to tell?
Yeah, it's just to make sure that we keep some distance between everybody. Last Sunday, we kept the social distancing, but it was pretty packed out.
Right.
And so we don't want to do that, so that's why we're doing 2 services.
Right. And for some people that are asking of why not 8:45 and 11 o'clock is, and I think I'm just going to answer for you. You can tell me if you're wrong, but it starts to get really hot, and so outdoor, we're trying to do just a little bit earlier to save us from the hotter days. So know that you either have to wake up a little bit early, or if you go into the second service at 10:30, bring some shade. We have umbrellas set up. There's trees there, so there's a lot of shade, but just handle yourself accordingly for the heat as it heats up.
Yeah, sorry about the earlier time, but just gets worship done earlier.
Right.
Get the rest of the day. It'll be awesome.
Yeah, I set up, so I appreciate the earlier time because it gets hot carrying stuff. We will have bottled water for you guys, and then remember, get on our website on all the stuff with face masks and all that type of stuff. We're going to have new stuff implemented, so just check that annually before you guys come, just to make sure that everything's squared away. You have anything other to tell them about that?
I don't think so.
Okay. Remember that obviously you're watching us here on Facebook Live, but we're also on YouTube Live as well. Some people like that platform better, just the way the videos go out on social media. It seems to be a little bit clearer, so check out that platform, subscribe to us. We have an app for you guys to have on your phones, and then we have a website, calvary-tricities.org, and again, all that information's on there, so check it out.
You guys, we've been getting lots of questions about giving and stuff, and so on the app and on the website, there are sections there that tell you how you can give if you want to do that. So.
All right, so that's all I have. You guys can comment on there. If you have prayer requests, put them on there. Pastor Steve will pray for you, praise reports. Let us know where you're watching from. All that great stuff. Okay, let's jump into some questions here, Pastor Steve. My first one is regarding, let me change my platform here and put it up here. Bible translations with a certain company. And I'll just read it. What do you think of Zondervan being bought out by HarperCollins, who also publishes the Satanic Bible among other non-Christian books? Some people have said they are changing translations like the NIV, ESV, NLT, and removing certain texts that we used to have in those Bibles. And then secondly, how also do they decide what texts and verses are otherwise in or out?
Okay. First off, I think my secretary checked out we got this question earlier, so my secretary actually checked out the whole Satanic Bible thing. One of the things that you need to realize about publishing houses is that they're companies, and the fact that you got a publishing house doesn't make it necessarily a Christian publishing house. And so Zondervan was a Christian publishing house. If they've been bought out by HarperCollins, which apparently is not. And so you get all of that with it. And I don't like that, but that's the way that whole thing goes. And so that's a different issue altogether than the translation itself. Okay, now speaking about the translation, the issues that you're talking about have to do with the Greek text, and this is a really, really old argument, you guys. This started back in the 1800s, and so there were a couple guys, Westcott and Hort, who pushed for a revision of the Bible, and in their push for the revision of the Bible, they came up with this whole scenario on how the text of the Bible got put together. And the scenario turned out to be completely false, but basically this was it. It was the idea that the text of the New Testament was pretty rough when it was first written down, meaning spelling errors and grammar errors. And that's what we mean by rough. And that somewhere in the early centuries, right around probably 400 to 600 AD, that there was a revision where they went through and they cleaned up the text of the New Testament, and that any of the Greek manuscripts that we have after that point, because of this revision, were Greek texts that should be ignored, and that only the earliest texts of the New Testament were things that should be used in Bible translations. That's where you get the revision of the 1880s. And so there was a big argument back then. There were guys who came out radically against that, and my wife is calling me. Somebody call my wife and tell her that I'm doing something. There were guys that radically opposed that, and they had good reasons for that, and there's been an argument about that ever since. Now, that whole thing with the textual revision back in anywhere from the 4th to the 6th centuries is nonsense. There is no evidence for this at all. And the reason that we have this argument going on is because you have different, basically, texts of the Greek New Testament. You have some differences there depending on geography. And so you have what are called Western texts, and you have Alexandrian texts, and then you have what are called the Eastern texts or the Byzantine texts. And the Byzantine texts happen to be the texts that have the best grammar and the best spelling, which in the minds of these textual critics means it's no good. And I've always had a problem with that.
Right.
You know, it's like I'm kind of a type A personality, and I hate it when I write a text or I write an email and I have a grammar error. And when I read my New Testament, Paul the Apostle is major type A. The guy's not going to be writing stuff down that has grammar errors in it. And you can be sure that he'd be checking it out. And I know that he had what's called an amanuensis, that a guy who wrote the text down as he dictated it. But you can be sure that that guy was checking it out. I have a real problem with that whole thing. One of the things that you have with the earliest texts of the New Testament is that they don't agree with each other. So you have basically you have two major ones that are pointed to: the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus. These are Bibles, copies of the New Testament in Greek that we have, and they are the earliest. But they have all kinds of errors in them, and they don't agree with each other, and they don't agree with the vast majority of the manuscripts. And so basically we got a situation where you have well over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, and the vast majority of them, the guys with the Westcott and Hort type of attitude towards textual criticism, have thrown out the vast majority of the Greek manuscripts. And even though a lot of those Greek manuscripts are late, which means that we have copies that are from the Middle Ages, for example, even though they're late, they came from somewhere. And so you got this whole thought process with what Greek manuscripts should be used that literally leaves out the majority of the evidence and uses prejudicial arguments to try to do that. And I don't think that that's valid. When I was first a Christian and I started looking into this, I thought earlier was better, until I found out that not only do the earliest manuscripts have errors, like major errors in them, and they don't agree with each other, but we have earlier letters with quotes from the New Testament that match the later manuscripts. And when I found that out, and what I mean by that is we have what are called Byzantine readings in the early church fathers. And the early church fathers predate the earliest full copies that we have of the New Testament. We have partial copies from before that point. And so if you have Byzantine readings in the 2nd century, that means that some dude's reading a King James version in the 2nd century. What you would generally call a King James or a New King James version, the guy's reading it in the 2nd century. So you can't say that the readings of the Byzantine or the New King James or King James are to be ignored when they obviously have those readings before the Sinaiticus, before the Vaticanus.
Right.
And I know I just use tons of big words and all that kind of thing, but this is an argument. This is an argument over Greek texts. And so that is, I've gone through and I've read the different arguments and looked at some of the evidence, and I came away convinced that I'd rather use a King James or a New King James as my study Bible than any of the more modern versions. The NIV, the ESV, and not because they're bad translations. They translate what they're translating decently or well, depending on which translation you're talking about. It's just that the Greek that they're using, I don't think is the most accurate. I think that the Greek behind the King James and the New King James is better Greek. The other thing that you have with this is the Eastern Church, which is the Byzantine Church. The Eastern Church had access to the autographs, which is the original copies, or the original writings and the copies. They had access, literal access to those autographs for centuries longer than anywhere else. So the Alexandrian copies never had access to the autographs. And the Western copies never had access to the autographs. And so to take Alexandrian and Western and put them over the Eastern tradition doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And one of the reasons that the Byzantine texts were used for the majority texts and that kind of thing is because those are the texts that the Greek churches were using when they put their New Testament together. They're literally reading the Greek. They don't read a translation. They're literally reading the Greek. And so you have Greek churches reading Greek manuscripts, and it seems to me that there would be some weight behind that they would care about the manuscripts that they're using and be careful with those things. So all that to say that my study Bibles are King James or New King James. That's what I study out of. I still use NIV, and I still use NLT. That's a New Living Translation. I'll use the NASB, the New American Standard Version. I'll use those Bibles. I just use them if I want to use their translation of a certain passage. And even when I'm doing that, I'm careful to look at their translation and see if it's an accurate version of that passage. So, what else?
Well, so that's the textual criticism.
Yeah.
I have an NIV, but it's Zondervan.
Right.
So what do you think about HarperCollins buying out Zondervan, publishing, it says Satanic Bible. I looked up some other definitely non-Christian books. What do you think about that being over a certain translation? Would you continue or not continue to buy that or go the translation because someone over that is in that area?
Well, if I was going to use an NIV, I'd be using a 1984
Right.
NIV. And so they've
Just because of the philosophical implications?
Right, yeah. And so there were major problems with the NIV before HarperCollins got involved. And so there's a 2011 translation, today's NIV, today's New International Version, where they literally went through and changed what the text had to say based on gender equality.
Right.
And so they're not giving you a translation at that point. When they're changing the gender in a passage, they are not giving you the translation. And
that's major Greek vocabulary right there.
Right, yeah. If it is translating, if the guy who's writing it is writing it in the classical form, which used the masculine to be all-inclusive, and what that means is generally classically you would say something that was inclusive of everybody. Whoever comes to Jesus, if he will follow him, and use the he in that passage, you're not leaving out women. Mm-hmm. It's just the classical way that all genders were included. That's what the translation, or that's what the words actually say. And I'm not interested in some dude coming along and changing the words because he thinks I'm going to get offended by what the dude wrote down 2,000 years ago. I'm a big enough guy to know that 2,000 years ago they talked differently than I do, or than the culture does. And so you don't want a translation that does that.
Right.
And so the 2011 translation, the TNIV, does that kind of thing. There were some problems even with the 2005 translation. And so I've got a 1984 NIV version. And again, when you're talking about these translations, you got to understand what the philosophy was behind the translations. So I read an article that said 64,000 words were changed between the NIV and the King James version. And that's misleading in the sense that so for example, from the King James to the New King James, gosh, I think there was something like 8,000 words were deleted. Well, they're not deleted. What's happening is you're going through and either getting a more literal translation of a passage, which sometimes leaves out words. The King James, admittedly, is a flowery translation, and so they're adding words in the King James version. You can see it. They'll tell you when they do it by putting them in italics. And so they add words to make it flow. So there's a balance there. You can't just go straight from Greek into English because it's not going to make any sense. It's like going straight from Spanish into English and you're putting all your nouns before your adjectives. And so it's English is different than Greek. And so some of that has to do with that. Some of it has to do with changes in the text. So there are places where there are texts that are left out based on the Greek text, not just on the Bible. So back to HarperCollins. HarperCollins most likely is not going to be changing the text of the NIV. They're just a publisher. If they do that, they're going to be messing with the copyright. And so that's not the issue. And so that's guilt by association as far as HarperCollins, Satanic Bible, and the NIV. That's guilt by association. There's a difference between that and HarperCollins actually changing the text of the NIV.
Right.
So again, when I'm looking at my Bibles, there are Bibles that I use for study Bibles. I'll use my King Jimmy or I'll use my New King James for my study Bible. I know that an NIV is what's called a thought translation. They are not translating word for word out of the Greek. What they're trying to do is they're trying to give you the intent. They're trying to give you where a King James or a New King James is trying to give you word for word, a word in Greek versus a word in English. The NIV is trying to give you a concept in Greek versus a concept in English. And so you have to know that when you're reading an NIV. And if you know that, then you're not going to have problems with it because you know what you're doing there. When you're talking about an NLT is another step beyond an NIV. It's a paraphrase. And so what they're doing is they're trying to make it easy language, getting the concepts across, getting the thoughts across, but they're trying to make it as easy as possible. And so they're going to take more latitude with a translation. And so for example, there are changes between the King James and the New King James as far as idiom goes. And so I don't mean to be crass, but there's an idiom in the Old King James, he who pisseth against a wall. And that's literally what it says in Hebrew. That's what it says. And so the King James writers have taken that and brought it straight across into English, and then they let you figure out what's being spoken about. Where when you get to a New King James, it translates that as a boy, because a boy is somebody who would do that, right? And so, and so we've left out some words there. You still have the concept, but we've left out some words. And generally speaking, I would rather that the translators just leave it alone and let me figure it out. Mm-hmm. And then when I'm doing my study Bible, just leave it alone, let me figure it out. And then if I want somebody's opinion on what that means, I can go to an NIV, I can go to an NLT. And if you have the same verses there, then you can get that. So it's a matter of knowing what you're dealing with in those situations. And again, HarperCollins, obviously a non-Christian company. They are publishing all kinds of different books, and so if that bugs you, then don't buy it.
Sure.
But in any case, I would be going with a 1984 NIV if I was using it in my studies. The 2011 version is pointless.
Okay.
In my opinion.
All right, moving on. I have a question regarding how Christians deal with each other. How do you suggest that Christians handle the COVID scenario in-house, meaning Christians arguing about different points of view on when and how to reopen church? I've seen what appears to be a lot of arguing over social media regarding this topic. So obviously the world is divided, to say the least, on this. How should Christians interact with each other regarding the situation that has to deal with the church?
You know, I think it's the way that you interact with everything else. I think that you need to watch your moral outrage, man. There are people who are having moral outrage over the COVID-19 thing that have no moral outrage over the fact that the governor opened abortion clinics and called those essential. And I'm not interested in your moral outrage if that's your position. Now, obviously, that's not a situation with Christians, because hopefully Christians just have that attitude anyway. But you know, I am absolutely understanding of people who don't want to go to church, who don't want to be around other people, especially if you're in that category that is more susceptible to diseases in general and COVID-19 in particular. I think that there's a lot about the COVID-19 pandemic that has been overblown, and that is just factual. It's been overblown. Just read an article this week. CDC has downgraded the death rate from 2 to 3 to I've seen anywhere from up to 5%, all the way down to 0.3%, because those are more realistic numbers. And so now we're getting back to numbers that compare with the death rate of the flu, with the death rate for flu pandemics, and that was always the case. And again, not to say that you don't need to be careful about this. Again, I got a situation where my parents are prime targets for this kind of thing, and when I call them up, I ask them, "Have you been staying home? Have you been careful? Have the nurses been masked up when they've been coming over and that kind of thing?" Because I care about them, right? And so I'm aware of these situations. But at the same time, I think that this has become a political issue, and it's an obvious political issue as far as the way that things are being opened up in our state. We still have an open-ended situation with churches where, you guys, in our church, we cannot meet together as a whole at any time in the foreseeable future, according to the governor's orders.
Yep.
And so we're still in phase 1 in Benton County, and if we were in phase 4, we would only be able to have about 200 people in our building. And so I have to, at that point I'm doing 6 or 7 services for a Sunday morning. And there is no plan beyond that. We haven't been told anything. And so,
There's not even a date for phase 4 either, right?
Yeah, it's like they're talking about phase 2 maybe in July,
right,
for our area. And so this is looking more and more like nothing but a power grab. And this was the thing that I was worried about when we first started this whole thing, and so I'm still worried about that. The First Amendment didn't go away because there's a virus, and we are in the only situation in my lifetime where healthy people are being quarantined. I've been under quarantines before. I'm an older guy, and so I remember being under quarantine back in the 60s. You put sick people under quarantine. You didn't put healthy people under quarantine. And so now we've got it exactly the opposite of how they've always handled pandemics, where you take the population that's sick, you quarantine them, you try to keep them away from the healthy population. And we flipped that around on its head, and we're getting the results of all that. And again, one after another, we have specifically these are all Democrats that are doing this. Makes me nuts.
Yep.
And so one after another, Democratic governors are getting shot down in court over their orders being overreach. And it's just like these guys just do stuff, man. And so, the Bill of Rights, is not an option for a government. For our government, it's not an option. And Inslee is not the king, it's the Constitution that's king. So Trump's not king, Inslee's not king, Constitution is king in our country.
Yep.
And so I always want to keep that in mind, because although I'm a Christian and I don't want to be all politically involved, I'm really not interested in that. I get politically involved when there are moral issues. And this is a moral issue, you guys. What we have is a situation where the world is counting down towards the time of the Antichrist, when he's going to be a world dictator, and you think that you have boundaries put on you right now as far as what you can do or what you can't do, buying and selling, that kind of thing. When it comes to tribulation times, it's going to be intense. This is going to be a dictatorship, and we already see dry runs of these things going on. And one of the things that Christians are supposed to be doing is standing up for what's right in a situation. And so that's my position on this stuff. And so I'm not going to sit around and just be afraid. Actually, you guys, I loved the whole time that I was at home, because I got to get up and I got to just do church. It's like, it was kind of goofy because I knew what the guy was going to say, but still, I got to get up and just be a Christian. And I loved it. And in fact, when we decided to start doing services again, I was a little sad about it, but it's cool. I like getting together as believers, and it's what Jesus called us to do. And so I'm going to obey the Word of God. And if other people are afraid, okay, I can be gracious about that. And so I think that what needs to happen is people need to be gracious on both sides of this issue. But the people who are into the whole lockdown thing, you need to recognize that things are being taken away from you that are not just being taken away from you. They're being taken away from your children and from your grandchildren. And one of the things that you have with government is once they get a situation where they have some kind of power over the populace, they do not give it up. And this is one of those situations. And when I look at what's happening with this, it's scaring me in the sense that this, again, I hate having to do provisos with this thing, because if you don't say the right things, everybody thinks that you're just callous. And I'm not callous towards people. I'm really concerned about the older people in my fellowship. In fact, I called them out on Sunday morning. Everybody, I had them raise their hands. They're over 65, and I'm like, what are you guys doing? You're not wearing masks and stuff. And I made it a joke, but I'm making a point too. I'm concerned about people, and so I continue to be concerned about it. But there are things that are big issues here. And so if you're afraid of getting sick, I totally agree with you. And you want to stay home? Absolutely. I want you to. In fact, I had somebody call me up or write me and ask about his, I think his 74-year-old mom and like a 82-year-old dad. And, they wanted to come to church. And I just kind of encouraged him to, maybe you might want to think about doing the online services, because, I don't want people to come here and get sick.
Right.
And stuff. But people get to do what they want to, and it's not my job to go around running around telling everybody what to do. And what we do is tell people the truth, and we pray for them. And so I kind of keep that attitude in other areas too. There's a lot of stuff in this world that's none of my business, none ya. And I need to keep that in mind when I'm looking at the people who are around me. There's a lot of things that people do that are none of my business. And so if they want to stay home, none of my business. If they want to go to church, none ya, none of my business. And I need to be quiet and work with my own hands and honor the Lord.
Amen to that. All right, I don't have a name on this next one, Pastor Steve, but the question is regarding what hell is like. It says, I was wondering what hell is like. There are a number of passages in the Bible describing fire and torment. They mention Matthew 13:50, Mark 9:48, Revelation 14:10, and they say, but I've been hearing about new theories, how there isn't any fire and physical torment, and that rather they are more metaphorical. So what would you tell them regarding interpretation of what hell is like?
No, those are not new theories. They're old. Those are old theories. They're very ancient. Okay, and so Nothing new under the sun. Everything cycles through over and over again. The Bible talks about winds of doctrine. And so let me just talk to you about metaphorical issues. If I came to, when you're talking about a metaphor versus a reality, and you're using language like it's a situation where you're getting thrown into a lake of fire. So you just picture that, being thrown into a lake of fire. And then you call that metaphorical. When you're trying to do a simile, the reality is always more intense than the simile itself. That's the point. What you're trying to do is get, and you can be doing something that's hyperbole in the sense of you want to exaggerate for effect, and admittedly that can be the case in some issues. But when you're going through and you're looking at the language that's used for people who to go to hell, it's always scary. It's always dark. It's always like weeping and gnashing of teeth and screaming and that kind of thing, and then you throw in lake of fire. And so you want to make it metaphorical, go ahead. That just means that it's worse than burning in a lake of fire. And that's how I take that stuff. I don't, when I go through and I look at my Bible and it talks about Gehenna being the lake of fire, do I think that that's a literal place? I have this tendency, the older I get as a Christian, to take the Bible for exactly what it says. I don't know that that's not like literally true, a literal lake of fire. God can have that someplace, and he can cast people into it. One of the things that I think that the people from the metaphorical branch of theology leave out is the idea that there may be multiple destructions that are taking place when you're talking about hellfire. One of the things I've heard people say is that you're a spirit anyway, so what's a lake of fire going to do to you? That is not what the Bible teaches.
Right.
What the Bible teaches is that you get a new body, whether you're a non-believer or you're a believer. There's a resurrection of the just, and then there's a resurrection of the unjust. And so the unjust are raised from the dead just like the just are. And so presumably what they're getting is resurrection bodies. They're resurrected. And then their resurrection body is thrown into a lake of fire, and that apparently can be something that could destroy you in that way. And then your soul would live on in that situation, separated from God forever. And so you can have a literal lake of fire with a destruction that takes place of the resurrection body, and then your spirit being condemned to be separate from God, which would be another form of torment for the rest of eternity. And so all of those things, when you're going through and you're looking at those, you can go through and you can educate yourself on those situations. But I wouldn't go against the Bible. I wouldn't take what a modern, liberal theologian thinks about the Bible on any level over the actual words of Jesus. And so Jesus is the one who talked the most about hell. And the reason that he talked about hell the most is because he knows the most about it. He's the one who created the place. And he also knows that you don't want to be there. And he's trying to let you know that that's the case. And so I would take Jesus' word over anybody.
Yeah, I went through this not too long ago, and I realized that the lake of fire is the final resting place, and so you have different versions of hell and different descriptions. But when you go through the text, there are so many things that he uses to describe hell, as far as bars, a prison, the worm that doesn't die. Obviously, demons are there, the lake of fire, torment, you can't breathe. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it, so it could be multifaceted in the sense he's describing different parts of it. But like you said, just the descriptions of it.
Yeah.
If you even go through it and even just look, just let me wrap my mind about what that would be like. It's not good.
Right.
It's not good.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. You think about floating in a lake of fire. It's like, I can't imagine anything that's more painful than that. And that's the point. And so trying to make it something that's less than that is defeating the purpose of the person who is giving you the information, who is Jesus.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to go that direction.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, next question says this. where am I at? How do you discuss the Olivet Discourse with people who believe that it has already taken place and Jesus was only talking to that generation? This is from Wendy.
Hi, Wendy. The way I do it is by using Jesus' words. And so in Matthew chapter 24, and you know the Olivet Discourse, so you probably know what I'm talking about here. He talks about the fact that the tribulation that's coming, he says in verse 21, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no nor ever shall be." And so when he's talking about this period of time, he talks about the abomination of desolation, the fact that the Jews in Judea need to flee, and they better hope it's not on the Sabbath day. They better hope that it's not in winter. They better hope that they're not nursing babies at the time, and that kind of thing. And he says, because the tribulation that comes is going to be the worst that the world has ever seen up until that time and all the way through history. Okay, so let's go through and think of that. And so it's worse than the flood. So in Noah's flood, you had everybody on the planet killed except for 8 people on an ark. And Jesus says it's worse than that. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. And when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, the whole city was wiped out. Actually, the 4 of the 5 cities of the plain were wiped out with fire and brimstone coming down from heaven. It's worse than that. And when you're talking about Egypt, the plagues on Egypt were pretty radical. Firstborn ends up with the firstborn in every household being killed, and it's worse than that. And then you can go through and you could talk about you could talk about the destruction of the Canaanites. You can talk about the destruction of the northern nation of Israel, the destruction of the southern nation of Judah. It's worse than all of that. It's worse than all of that. And so then we talk about Matthew 24 being nothing but the taking of Jerusalem by the Roman armies. And this is what I always ask people. Actually, my fellowship, I have them raise their hands if they had ever heard of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD before they became a Christian. If they'd ever heard about it. And nobody's hand, almost to a person. There might have been 1 or 2 people over the years. And I've been in ministry since like 1983. And maybe 1 or 2 people in all the years that have asked that question have raised their hands and knew anything about the destruction of Jerusalem before they became a Christian. The destruction of Jerusalem is just like a blip in history as far as the world goes and as far as most people, even Christians, know about. It's just a blip in history. Jesus, when he's describing this event, he says it's the worst thing that the world has ever seen. And so the destruction of Jerusalem is not the worst thing that the world's ever seen.
Right.
And so that verse right there is something that they've never been able to get away from. And I just thump it home, and I don't let them walk away without considering it. Jesus is talking about something much more than the siege and the burning of a city. He's talking about a huge situation that involves the whole world. So
to exegete that passage, the generation he's talking about is a generation that sees those things take place.
Yeah. Well, as far as this goes?
Yeah.
Well, the things
we're talking about talking to people about that.
The Olivet Discourse.
Yeah.
The generation that sees those things take place. Well, later on in the passage here, Jesus gives a parable of the fig tree. He says, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Or surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." So let's just tear that apart. He talks about the parable of the fig tree, and that is something, actually, I don't want to do a whole Bible study on this, so you should get my Bible study on this passage specifically. Jesus cursed a fig tree just like the day before. And he did it before he went into go and turn over tables in the temple. And the fig tree has always been a symbol of Israel. All the trees in Luke, fig tree and all the trees were symbols of nations. And so there are nations that are complicit in the events of the last days. Israel is one of them. Russia is another one. Iran, Turkey, Libya, Ethiopia. Those are nations that are going to be involved in the last days. And so Jesus is talking about a series of events that are going to be taking place, coming together, and trees putting forth leaves. Then he says, verse 33, so you also, when you see all these things, though know that it's near at the doors. And so the ones who see these things, the things that he's talking about in these passages, probably the things that he's speaking about are the very first things, when you see wars and rumors of wars and that kind of stuff. And then he goes on and says this, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. And what the guys who want to make this the destruction of Jerusalem, or make the Olivet Discourse about the destruction of Jerusalem, take that phrase and they try to make Jesus say that generation, the generation that was there at the time of Jesus, was the one that was going to be there at the time of the fulfillment of all of that. And that's one possible interpretation. Here's another one. The one that sees the beginning of these things is the generation that is going to see the fulfillment of these things. And specifically in this passage, it's the parable of the fig tree, when the fig tree puts forth leaves. So Israel became a nation in 1948. The fig tree put forth leaves. And so the generation that saw 1948, the beginning of the nation of Israel, would be the generation that would see the fulfillment of all these things. There's another interpretation for you. And so the fact that he uses generation, and this generation specifically, doesn't mean that he's talking about the generation that was alive at the time that he was there. Most likely he's talking about the generation that sees these things begin to come to pass. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. And so that's how I deal with that. And I'd go into that in more detail, but the first part, with the tribulation being the worst time that the planet's ever seen, that's the one that's most effective, because there's no answer to that, except for that it hasn't happened yet.
Yep.
Yeah.
All righty. My next question is regarding homeschooling. It says, do you think with schools being shut down and also with the new sexual ed laws that are being implemented, that it's mandatory for Christians to take over their kids' education? For example, do you think homeschooling has now become a faith issue?
Here's my view on homeschooling. I think that if you can, you should. I think it's a really good idea. I think that having a one-on-one tutor for a kid going through schooling is much better than having a 1-on-20 or a 1-on-30 tutor. That's what teachers are in public and in private schools. And so I think that makes all kinds of sense in the first place. In the second place, the whole issue of the immorality that you see in the public school arena, I think that's a big issue. I think it's something that Christians need to be paying attention to. And like you said, with this whole sex ed bill, that would be a deal breaker for me. I would have a real problem with that. I have a real problem with that. And so I think that more Christians need to be involved in the public school. One of the things that Christians have a tendency to do is they withdraw from the culture, and when the culture goes south, they see that as a confirmation that they should have withdrawn in the first place. How about this? We take over the culture. How about we do that? How about we take it back to what public schools used to be, where morality was taught and where citizenship was taught and where actual reading was taught and arithmetic, like real arithmetic was taught and those kinds of things. and not a lot of the social nonsense that we have going on nowadays. How about we do that? And you know, when you withdraw, what you do is you leave a vacuum, and you know, it's really easy to go downhill. And it's always easier to go downhill than it is to go uphill. And so I don't like the whole idea of retreating. I don't like that. And so we're living in an area, especially in our area, that's more conservative, and you have the ability to elect school board members that have half a brain, and you have the ability to be involved in classrooms. And so if you're a Christian, you got a kid in public school, if my kid was involved in public school, I would be all up in the middle of that. And I would be talking to the teachers, and I would be involved there, and I'd probably be making myself a pest if that's the only options that I had. And so there's that. Private school, I can tell you that we're not going to do anything, you know, along the lines of the sex ed stuff. That's just ridiculous. And we don't even do Common Core math. Actually, we get kids from public school that, you know, they come from public school and they come into our school and they just have a really hard time with math because of what's been going on with Common Core, and they don't understand it. So I think that there's still balance on that. I love Christian teachers in the public school arena. That's where we need to be. We need to be infiltrating the culture, and so again, I don't want to give up on all that. But you know, like you said, this whole sex ed thing that would be a deal breaker for me. If I know that they're in there corrupting my child, I'm going to have a problem with that. I'm going to do what needs to get done to make sure that my child is not being corrupted. So there are ballot initiatives that are out right now. Have you signed one? And we need to get this on the ballot so that we can vote it down. A lot of the stuff that our state is doing, they vote on it in the middle of the night and on Fridays and that kind of thing, so that they don't get blowback from the populace. And I think that we need to be causing a ruckus. And if you don't cause a ruckus, you just get more of this stuff. So. Having said all that, I don't think homeschool is for everybody, and this is what I mean by that. I think it would be for everybody if everybody would do it. But I've known some homeschool kids that didn't get homeschooled. They got left alone, and their education went down the tank because you got an 8-year-old that you're treating like he's 24, and he's not. And so you're going to do homeschool, you got to be on top of it, and you got to be taking care of it. Otherwise, you're going to cause your kid a problem. And so if I couldn't do homeschool and I wasn't comfortable with a public school, I would be doing private school. And I would still be involved with private school too. You know, we've got a private school here, and we pay attention to moral issues and that kind of thing, and I make sure that those things get done. My wife actually runs the school. And so we have talks about these things routinely, and there are issues there that need to be taken care of, and we do our best to do exactly that. We don't. One of the things that we don't want to do with our private school is raise a bunch of little hypocrites, people who pretend to do things on the outside and aren't changed on the inside. We want kids that walk away loving Jesus, and we're not going to be able to do that with everyone, but I think that that's something that needs to be paid attention to. That's one of the problems with private schools. You can have outward obedience in the sense of in the classroom. You know, you can have private school Christian kids who, you know, toe the line and do chapel and all that stuff during school, and then on the weekends they go out and party like every other heathen, and that's not acceptable. And so there needs to be a reality there. So in all this stuff, you got to be discerning, and you got to be paying attention to what's the best for your kid, and that kind of thing. But you want your kid to be educated. And so I've known some homeschoolers who had high hopes for what they were doing, and they ended up having real problems. And so you got to be, you know, if you're going to do homeschool, you got to be able to do homeschool. and you got to be committed to it. And if you can't do that, then I think that the next step would be private school if you don't want to be involved in the public school. So.
Would you apply that same philosophy to college as well, seeing how the universities is one of the biggest influencers of a kid right there? And so depending on their maturity and stuff, they get plucked off even when they're older too. So would you tell them different things? Because when I graduated high school, it was like you go to college or you don't get a good job.
Right.
You know, and now the pendulum seems to be changing specifically because of the philosophies that are being taught at our universities.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, have you guys seen these on the street reporters who go up and ask people questions about history, and college students, you know, ask them about history and they know nothing?
Nothing.
And
like major events.
Like
have you ever heard of
Civil
Hitler?
War.
And they don't know.
what was the Civil War about?
Yeah.
You know, who fought the Civil War? Or, you know, America and France. You know, that kind of thing. And colleges that don't teach, you know, it's like anything. It's just wasting money. It's just a waste of money. And so with my son specifically, he went to college and he went to school to be involved in the medical field. And what's cool about that is it's actual science.
Yep.
You know, and so you know, there's not a lot of nonsense that's involved in that. In fact, they militate against the nonsense. But if my kid was going to school for a business degree or, you know, something like that, I would definitely be choosing the school. I'd be looking at what was happening at the school, looking at the professors, and I would not waste my money on nonsense. So, yeah, you know, there are some areas that Christians could make huge inroads into this culture, and college is one of those places where like you actually teach history and you actually teach physics and you actually teach, you know, you go through and actually teach and keep the nonsense out, and man, you could make huge inroads. Yeah. You know, the people that come out of your school could be just cranking in other places. You know, just talking about our school specifically, our public school, we only go up to 8th grade at this point, and the high schools around here love us. They love our kids because our kids go into their schools and they raise the test scores, and so that's what they tell us. We want your kids. They raise our test scores because, you know, what we're doing is actually teaching them stuff, teaching them the things that they know. And so this is not rocket science, and neither is college. It's not rocket science, unless it is rocket science. then that's cool. But yeah, I would be paying attention to that too. Yeah.
All right, last one. We have a few minutes left here. How do you handle, I guess there was another Christian artist in the news today or whatever, Hawk Nelson Band or whatever, that left his faith. What should Christians' response be to the people who are in the world who watch this stuff? How do we approach that in regards to apostasy and the ongoing, obviously, Jesus talked about this, but the ongoing apostasy of public Christian figures?
Well, you know, one of the things I think that we need to be doing is praying for the people who are in this position. You know, we were just talking about publishing houses, you know, and the fact that they're non-Christian. Well, it's exactly the same situation in the music world, because you used to have Christian labels, and now what's happening is the Christian labels were making huge amounts of money, and so they got sold off to secular labels, and you know they'll have a Christian sub-label or whatever, but it's secular, and so you got a lot of pressure on these guys, and they're in the middle of the world, and there's all kinds of drugs going on. You know, it's drugs and sex and rock and roll, and you know, it's like that's what the world's like in that culture, and all of that stuff comes into the Christian culture. You could talk to anybody who's been involved in it. One of our worship leaders, Brandon, has had conversations with me about this, and these guys are under huge amounts of pressure, and so they need to be prayed for. It's kind of a scary place to be because you got people who are so worldly and so fleshy in those areas. And so first off, I'd be praying for those guys, And then secondly, the fact that somebody walks away from Jesus doesn't mean that Jesus is a liar. In fact, maybe that means that the person who walked away from Jesus loved something more than Jesus. Maybe that's it. And so the Bible talks about, actually there's a passage in 2 Peter, let me read it to you.
Okay.
Get there. This is 2 Peter in chapter 2, and it says, while they promised them liberty, this is 2:19. While they promised them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption, for by whom a person is overcome, by him also he's brought into bondage. For if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and overcome, the latter end is worse for them than the beginning. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. But it has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to his own vomit, and a sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. And that's a great description of somebody who walks away. And so when I've had conversations with people about folks who have walked away, one of the things, I walked away from the Lord. And the reason I walked away from the Lord was because I was ashamed of being a Christian because I was such a lousy one. And so I walked away. There were things that I couldn't get past. And so I just decided to go back in the world. And that's exactly what happened to me. It was like a dog returning to his vomit. It's like a pig, returning to washing in the mire. It would have been better for me not to have known the way of righteousness than to turn from it and go right back into the world. It was worse for me the second time around in the world than it was the first time. And luckily Jesus had a hold on me. Well, it wasn't luck, but Jesus had a hold on me, and he turned the whole thing around for me. And so I'll let people know that, and then I'll just say, watch this guy. Watch what they do. Watch where they go. Watch how bad it gets for them. And even in their disobedience, they'll be fulfilling Scripture. And I like to make that point. And so generally speaking, when I'm talking to a non-believer and they come up with some Christian that's done something, whether it's a public figure or whether it's somebody that they know privately, I always tell them, you know what? Jesus didn't tell us to follow those people. What Jesus told us to follow was him. And so has Jesus ever done that? Has Jesus ever done those things to you? Has Jesus ever acted like that? And get it right back to the Lord. Because it's really easy to talk about issues out here, but when you start talking about Jesus, that's a hard issue.
Yeah.
And people get really nervous when you start doing that. So just get it right back to Jesus.
Amen.
Yeah.
All right, guys, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching the show. Appreciate it. Hopefully you've been blessed today. For you local guys, this Sunday, May 31st, we're having a food drive. It's going to be 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Sunday, May 31st. There's a list of items that we're requesting on our website if you want to get on there and check it out. And you can just drop it off here at our church, Calvary Chapel, Tri-Cities. Remember, guys, we're on Facebook Live. We're on YouTube Live. All our services are going on there live as well. If you want to join us in person, we have an 8:30 and 10:30 Sunday morning service in our outdoor amphitheater. There's also some instructions on our website that I'd have you check out. Bring a lawn chair and things like that. Remember, we have an app, we have a website, calvarytricities.org. And if you guys need anything, email us, reach out to us, and we'd love to hear from you and get into contact if you need counseling, things of those nature. So again, thanks guys, appreciate you watching the show. We'll see you next Wednesday.